Hello everybody and welcome back to more of the Labyrinth of Grisaia. In the last episode, we learned that Kazuki, being the genius of the family, made her parents basically love and adore her, and Yuuji was unfortunately pretty shunned in his household life. You can ignore this bluish grayish text here because I played like 5 minutes of the game and had to leave and had to shut the game off, so it obviously saved the fact that I had read it, even though I don't have a save file past this or anything, so. Alrighty. Didn't miss anything important, so. You're abnormally adorable today, JB. Do you know that? Do you know how adorable you are? You're so adorable.
何よ、突然。
Well, I was just thinking it's been a while since I had some of your coffee. Just my way of showing my gratitude. I'm waking up to the smell of miso soup pretty often these days. Maybe I'm starting to appreciate that sort of thing a little more. All thanks to Amane, I suppose.
あまねちゃんのことは知っているんでしょ?
Some days I wish I didn't. And she was a classmate of Kazuki's, you mean? Yeah. Only found out fairly recently, though.
彼女を恨んではいないの?
I don't think she was responsible for Kazuki's death, and either way, it's not like blaming her would bring the dead back to life, now would it? I mean, if you'd given me a choice between Amane and Kazuki back at the time of the accident, I mean, I obviously would have wanted my sister to survive. But at this point, you know, I'm seriously grateful to Kazuki for protecting her.
あなたにとってお姉さんとはどんな存在だったの?
No, Kazuki was Kazuki. Nothing more, nothing less. But if you really want something more conceptual, I guess I saw her as something akin to God.
神ね.
Oh, that's just how much of a kid I was. Anyway, let's keep going with that document, shall we? Eventually, my sister entered a famous private school on the wishes of our parents. Through high-quality instruction appropriate for someone of Kazuki's talents, her aesthetic would mature and evolve, bringing her art to an even higher level of sophistication. Well, that was the idea, at least. But my sister deliberately betrayed her parents' overblown expectations, shunning Takazono Academy's fine arts clubs in favor of the basketball team. Her grades in academic subjects and PE alike were suspiciously consistent 70s across the board. Hiding her overwhelming talents, Kazuki pursued a tranquil everyday life. That sharp tongue of hers still made a few appearances, of course. But in a school for rich young ladies, a slightly thorny attitude was nothing out of the ordinary. On top of which, Kazuki was trying very hard to come off as a pleasant, mild-mannered girl to her classmates. She managed to gather a good number of friendly acquaintances through that act. She'd pick out useful or competent girls from the group for special attention, controlling them like pawns to her own advantage. Well, controlling is probably a little too harsh. The people my sister manipulated didn't really notice it was happening. Rather than forcing them to do something, she'd subtly guide them towards certain choices. You know, for the most part, they did exactly what Kazuki wanted without even realizing that she was influencing their actions. I was the only one who knew what my sister really was. And that was only because she discussed her real intentions so frankly with me ever since we were young. Even our parents weren't always aware they were dancing on Kazuki's strings. I was deeply, deeply afraid of her. Kazuki can't be human. Maybe she's some kind of god. I was the only one who understood my sister's true nature. But terrifying as she was, I was also completely dependent on her. I assumed that I would keep living in the palm of Kazuki's hand for many years to come. Right up until the day she left for her basketball team's summer training camp. It was my sister's first summer vacation since entering Takazono Academy, following a relatively uneventful few months for our strained family. Kazuki was participating in an overnight camp as a member of the Takazono basketball team. For about a week, she would be staying at a campground in Nagano Prefecture. She'd always been at the center of that lopsided family, counteracting the centrifugal forces that would have otherwise ripped us apart. She was the balanced shaft that kept our household rotating smoothly, and now, suddenly she was gone. That week stretched on and on. The anxiety was suffocating, inescapable. It felt as though I'd been left all alone on a sailing boat in a totally calm sea. Only 2 days after Kazuki left the house, my parents began to argue viciously every day they encountered each other, and every time they encountered each other. And if I was unfortunate enough to be somewhere nearby, it would usually end with Dad blindsiding me with harsh words and harassment that I earned simply for being a convenient target. The coffee's too damn hot. That was enough of a reason for my father to throw a mug at my head. It wasn't the first time something like that had happened. A few days without my sister and we were already falling apart. Was the absence of God all it took to make people into such ugly creatures? Picking up the fragments of that shattered mug, I watched my mother sobbing impotently on the floor, and found myself praying that Kazuki would come home as soon as possible. I held my breath. I'd made myself small, like some frightened animal burrowing deep into the ground. I tried desperately to avoid my father's wrath, waiting for my sister's return. Once Kazuki comes back, once God returns, I wouldn't have to hide myself anymore. All I had to do was keep quiet and endure. This nightmare would end eventually. I was used to enduring this sort of thing. As long as I didn't get greedy, I wouldn't get hurt. I wouldn't suffer too much. I'd just be a little lonely for a while, a little sad. It wouldn't kill me. After all, this bed of nails was only temporary torment. That miserable week was finally past and it was all but over now. Today my sister was coming home. God was returning. She was never easy to deal with, but having her around sure beat the alternative. In that respect, I suppose Kazuki really was a divine presence in our lives. People who can laugh off the idea of God just don't know how lucky they are. That's only an option for someone who's never found themselves completely helpless. Someone who's never looked up at the sky and screamed through their tears. In the end, my prayers dissolved meaninglessly into the clouds. My sister didn't get back on time. At first, we assumed the bus was caught in traffic, but after a few hours that started to seem less and less likely. The team's advisor who'd been in charge of the trip wasn't answering his cell phone. We tried calling Kazuki instead, but heard only another mechanical voice informing us that her phone was turned off or out of range. I had a bad feeling about it. As I remembered my bitter childhood fantasies of a life without Kazuki, frightened what-ifs flitted through my mind, and I could feel sweat oozing coldly out of my pores. I'd spent years daydreaming about my sister disappearing. What right did I have to expect her to come back and rescue me now? Maybe she'd finally gotten sick of my selfishness and decided to leave for good. That sense of guilt grew heavy as a rock in the pit of my stomach, and I learned that Kazuki and her classmates had vanished without a trace. It was as if their bus had abruptly spirited off the face of the earth. Despite an all-out search effort by authorities along the route and on local police, 2 weeks crawled by with no progress whatsoever. Finally, the investigation headquarters set up by the Tokyo Metropolitan Police was dissolved, and the case was entrusted to the National Police Agency as a matter for long-term, wide-scale investigation. To put the matter more simply, they'd halfway given up on finding them. Local search efforts did continue, now personally funded by the families of the missing girls, but to no avail. Eventually, there was even talk that it might have been a mass kidnapping organized by a foreign country. And in the home, to which my sister never returned, my father, his principal source of income now gone, ranted and raved in a near frenzy. My mother, unable to oppose her husband, could do nothing but grieve and cry. I hid myself quietly in the shadows as our house filled with darkness, and one night I snuck into my sister's studio to gaze at her half-finished paintings. My sister can't possibly be dead. Kazuki's above death. Blind faith was all I had to cling to now. Maybe this disappearance was part of my sister's plan. Maybe she was living as a totally different person somewhere, enjoying the freedom and normality she desperately longed for. These ridiculous delusions at least allowed me to hold on to some fragile shred of hope. But in the end, even that meager refuge was shattered to pieces. A single student who had been on the basketball team trip with my sister was discovered in a farmer's field, where she'd been greedily devouring cabbage after cabbage. The girl was emaciated and exhausted, but managed to explain the situation to the local policeman, who rushed her to her hospital room. On the way back, the team had taken an old, unused mountain road to avoid congestion. Their tire had been punctured, and the bus plunged down a cliff in a section of the road with no guardrail. Fortunately, the bus didn't catch on fire after it stumbled down the slope, which means everyone probably would have died a lot faster. But it had landed at the bottom of a deep natural hole, separated from the road by thick greenery that made discovery very unlikely. And, of course, their cell phones were out of range. As for leaving to summon help on their own, the walls of the valley sloped over them, making it impossible to climb back up. And there was a possibility of escape through the dense virgin forest at the very bottom of the gorge, but there were many wounded, so the group opted for a conservative plan of waiting for help while conserving their supplies. At the bottom of a forest so thick that light barely reached them, the team endured for 2 long weeks. Finally, their limits of physical and mental endurance long since passed, the girls mustered their last ounces of strength for a desperate escape attempt. She was the only one to get out alive. When the police resumed their search based on the survivors' testimony, they found the fallen bus without much difficulty. It was now a crumpled wreck, lying at the bottom of a rocky gorge below an abandoned road, and it's still there to this day. On the site, they found signs of a struggle involving multiple individuals, along with numerous mutilated corpses, some already decomposed to the bone. My sister's death was officially confirmed in mid-September. The Takazono Academy bus disaster. Many details regarding this incident were deliberately concealed from the public, and the media supplemented its facts with exaggerated speculation, leading to a popular narrative that differed significantly from the truth in many respects. But at the time, I had no way of knowing that. And in any case, there was only one fact that seemed relevant for the Kazami family. The death of my sister. The death of God. It was too much to accept. My father raged, my mother wept. I actively refused to believe it. Kazuki can't possibly be dead. No matter how many times I repeated those childish words to myself, my sister wasn't coming back. With the passage of time, we slowly began to accept that fact, and our family began to crumble under its own weight. Despair spread through the house like a cancer. The fragile bonds that had tied us together rotted away with frightening speed. My father was devastated. His overblown expectations for my sister's future had come to nothing. All the money he'd spent on her education was now just another investment gone bust. One by one, the companies which had offered financing in anticipation of Kazuki's career abandoned him. Once the last lines of credit dried up, we no longer had any real source of income. Our living conditions deteriorated visibly from week to week. My family had always been a brittle, makeshift thing. Now with our only pillar of hope gone, that ramshackle structure gave up even trying to hold itself together. We had lost the energy to maintain the farce. Wallowing in self-pity over his misfortune, my father began drinking heavily nearly every single day. His mistreatment of my mother and me escalated into clear abuse. He hit the bars until dawn with less than savory friends, often ending up in the drunk tank for bellowing at some hapless waitress. When he did manage to stagger home, he beat Mom viciously, screaming, "I'm the master of this house!" Mom hadn't done anything wrong, but she still apologized every time he started hitting her. Again and again, desperately. I'm sorry. Not even knowing what she was apologizing for, she groveled with her forehead to the ground, whimpering the words like a terrified animal, waiting for the storm to blow past. My mother was a very weak person. In the old man's words, she was a woman with nothing going for her but her looks. He seemed to think he'd done her a real favor picking her up out of the bars where she'd been working for lack of any other way to support herself. Even I could tell that Dad never treated her particularly well. Still, she'd given birth to the golden egg. Her position as Kazuki's mother guaranteed her a fairly comfortable life. But now the role had been taken away from her, and she had nothing left to defend herself with. The same was true for me. With no way to fight back, I had no choice but to endure my father's irrational violence. I was essentially a living punching bag for him to vent his anger on. One night, when he came home particularly drunk, Mom pushed me into a wardrobe.
ここに隠れていなさい。お父さんはまたきっとすぐに寝てしまうから。私がいいと言うまではここから出てきてはダメよ。
I don't think she was worried about my safety for its own sake. Now that Kazuki was gone, my mother had simply grown dependent on me. I was the only ally she had left.
あなたのためにお母さん頑張るから。
Telling herself that was probably the only way Mom could see living as anything but a source of meaningless pain. The idea of protecting her only remaining child was a convenient means of bolstering her courage against the temptation to die. We endured for 3 months, trembling at every sound from the front door once night fell. Finally, my mother could take no more, and the two of us left that hellish house hand in hand. There weren't any relatives to take us in, and Mom never had held a real job outside of a nightclub and knew little of the world. With no real plan, we fled to Mabara in Chiba, the city where she'd grown up. She rented an apartment not far from her childhood home and told me that we'd be living here as a family of 2 from now on. Only 2 weeks later, before we'd even settled in, my father tracked us down. Screaming with rage, he knocked my mother to the ground, kicking and punching her viciously, and for the first time in my life, I stood up to him. Stop it, Dad. Mom didn't do anything wrong. My father's eyes went wide at my unexpected interference. Releasing his grip on his wife's hair, he turned and struck me hard in the side of the face. The impact was so strong I could feel my brain rattle against my skull. Stunned, I fell down onto my backside. I was only a child. No matter how hard I fought, I couldn't hope to match the sheer strength of a grown man. Still, I couldn't just crawl away. Now that Kazuki was gone, it was my job to protect my mother. She was the only thing I had left. And I understood all too well how miserable it felt to have no one on your side. I clung stubbornly to my father's legs, holding on even as his blows grew increasingly brutal. Mom had found the will to live by protecting me, and by taking that beating for her, it felt as though I discovered some point to my own existence. Maybe this was the reason I'd been born. True, I was defective compared to my big sister, but now that she was gone, I wasn't so meaningless anymore. I was the backup, the one who'd bear the brunt if Kazuki died. It all felt so clear to me now. My father swung his arm down furiously, catching me square in the temple. The cheap gold watch on his wrist must have struck my face. There was a dull crunching sound from my nose. Lukewarm blood began to ooze slowly down my forehead. When Mom saw the blood on my face, her voice rose to a frantic scream. In the end, Mom apologized countless times as my father ground his foot against her head, and the 3 of us went back home. Not to state the obvious, but Kazuki wasn't waiting for us there. Nothing had changed since we left. The god of that house was dead, and there was no replacing her. Still, for a while after we returned, my father was unusually quiet. Maybe the man was sobered by when he got home. Once or twice, he even apologized. But that period of relative calm didn't last long. We were quickly eating through the money Kazuki had left behind, and my father couldn't adjust to our newly meager lifestyle. His debts accumulated until we were all but buried under their weight. And as his fears about the future grew, Dad once again started to quiet his anxiety through explosions of violence. Nothing was going to change. If we stayed with this man, he was just going to drag us down with him. For the second time, Mom and I decided to leave. We'd messed up on our first try. He found us because we ran to such a familiar place. This time we were going to some place where nobody knew us, some town we'd never even seen before. When you're trying to lay low, the basic rule is to look for an area with a large population and a high rate of residential turnover. But my mother, naturally enough, didn't know that at the time. So after a few hours transferring from train to train seemingly at random, we arrived in the rural southwest of Gunma Prefecture. I don't recall it too clearly. I was still a child being pulled along by his mother, and it was all a little overwhelming. But I do remember it was a quiet country town, about 40 minutes from the central Takasaki station. Mom had walked out of the door with nothing but the clothes on her back, telling my father she was taking me shopping. Given the circumstances, we hadn't been able to take much money. At a small real estate agency on the outskirts of town, nearly half of our escape fund had vanished for the deposit on a one-story rental house.
ここが今日から私とユージの住むお家よ。
Mom wanted privacy from the neighbors, but renting a detached house had been a real financial stretch. The place we found hadn't been inhabited in years. It was as desolate and dusty as a haunted house. There wasn't even a flush toilet. In itself, it wasn't exactly the most pleasant place you could call home, but the only thing that really mattered was that Mom and I had it to ourselves. Dad wasn't there. That was enough to make even a shabby house feel like paradise. Mom had her name removed from her old certificate of residence and appealed to have our change of address information restricted, and giving her status as a victim of domestic violence. After explaining the circumstances to the local school, she handled the procedures for my transfer as well. We had a home, and I had a school to attend. But we barely had time to catch our breath before the main problem reared its ugly head. Well, to put it simply, we didn't have any money. After a week spent sighing at her rapidly thinning wallet, Mom steeled herself and went out to find employment. Her days were spent working part-time at a canning factory, her nights as a hostess in a snack bar near the station.
もうね、私にはユージしか残ってないの。あなたが一人前になって、自分で働いて暮らしていけるようになるまでは、私が頑張るから。何も心配しなくていいのよ。
Mom was orphaned, so young that her education effectively ended before she left middle school. Determined to keep me from suffering the same hardships, she threw herself into a grueling work schedule. In the mornings, I left the house with her when she headed out to her part-time job at the cannery. As we walked together, Mom pushing along the beat-up old bicycle she'd bought used, our neighbors would stare with undisguised hostility and whisper to each other. The woman who ran away from the city to ditch her husband. That was the only name they knew my mother by in that insular little town. When someone said that woman in our neighborhood, there was no mistaking who they meant.
おはようございます。
When she greeted them, there was no response. There never was. But once we passed by, we could hear whispers from behind our backs. What was that? I don't remember becoming her friend. And if Mom opted for nothing but a silent nod instead, it would be, I can't tell what's going on inside that woman's head. Well, when you get right down to it, they didn't like having some strange outsider and her child in their neighborhood. The place had that quasi-medieval atmosphere typical of small rural towns. Just the fact that we'd come from Tokyo seemed to invite hatred. And it certainly didn't help that Mom was a single mother with no local ties. We were more or less ostracized. Seasons changed, but the eyes of our neighbors never grew any warmer. The only locals who welcomed my mother's arrival were the male customers at the snack bar by the station. That night job must have contributed to her negative reputation as well. One day, a classmate at school used a word I'd never heard before. I honestly didn't know what it meant. So when I got home that afternoon, I asked my mother, somebody told me your mom's a whore at school today. What does that mean? Sometimes innocence can be crueler than malice. Meeting my gaze, Mom forced a quavery, defeated smile onto her face and said only, "I'm sorry."
ごめんね、ユージ。ごめんなさい。
I didn't have the first idea what she was apologizing to me for. It was more irritating than anything else. But I did understand that I must have said something I shouldn't have. What does Mom have to apologize for anyway? She's protecting me, isn't she? Mom was working hard to support the two of us. She didn't have a thing to be ashamed of. There was no reason for her to be sorry. Even as a child, or well, maybe exactly because I was a child, I believe that absolutely. My mother was a kind person, but no one treated her kindly. She'd finally managed to escape Dad, but she was still apologizing every time she opened her mouth. Very quickly, I learned to hate the words "I'm sorry." I wanted to grow up right away. Watching my mother sacrifice herself to keep me fed was just too frustrating. I needed to become adult so I could help her too. At that young age, I was already starting to strain for something like self-sufficiency. Still, there wasn't much I could actually do to contribute. With the exception of washing the rice and setting our cooker when Mom came home drunk from her bar. To be honest, my mother wasn't the best cook even when she was sober. But when she was living on her own as a hostess with a nocturnal lifestyle, she mainly got by on convenience store lunches and the snacks her customers brought her to work. And even after she married and became a mother, we usually ate out or had something delivered. It was pretty rare for her to make an actual meal. When she told me we were going to cook for ourselves from now on to save money, all I could think was, I wonder how long that's gonna last. As it turned out, our dinners were mostly canned food Mom took home from a part-time job plopped onto a plate, supplemented by very basic stir-fry or boiled dishes. And late in the month, as our money ran low waiting for the next paycheck, there were days when we had nothing but fried rice on our table.
今日はこれしかないの。ごめんね。
It was a shoddy-looking lump of rice with fish paste or frozen vegetables as the only other ingredients. But I was used to simple food, and I didn't mind the taste. The only thing I hated about those meals was hearing my mother apologize as she put them on the table. Every time she reflexively muttered, "I'm sorry," I thought of all the times she said that phrase before. A chain of meaningless words stretched back into the past made me sad for reasons I couldn't express. We carried on like that for a full year. Definitely wasn't an easy situation, but I tried to lessen my mother's burden by adjusting to our frugal new lifestyle as best I could. I didn't need anything more. Well, a decently sized fridge would have made things a little more convenient. Not exactly a Charles Dickens novel, just a humble life. Wasn't so bad. Wasn't bad at all. I could go through my daily routine without causing problems for someone else. I had enough food that I wouldn't starve. When I was injured or sick, I could go to the doctor. The two of us just had to scrape along like this for a while. Eventually I'd start working and would be able to afford a little more in the ways of luxuries. But just as that modest hope was starting to take root in my heart, it was ripped away by a terror I'd nearly managed to forget.